Hello, innovators. I am Dustin Miller, PolyInnovator. Today I'm talking with Christopher Bishop, the TEDx speaker, LinkedIn learning instructor, and nonlinear multimodal careerist. I love that term. And even a bass player, actually. Thank you for joining me on the Polymath Polycast.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here. Looking forward to our conversation.
Oh, yeah. We were even going on tangents even before the call, so it's going to be really interesting while we go in the actual topics. So what I like to do is please say hello to the innovators in the audience.
Hello, innovators. It's a big job, but I think you're all capable of it. So I would encourage you to think along those lines. We're going to talk about innovation today, and hope you'll get some ideas about how you might focus on being an innovator and being a polymath as well.
Yeah, definitely. I love that. And so one thing I had here to say is that we're here to talk about the future careers and how they evolve, as well as even the future of education. So it's going to be a lot of innovation.
Yeah, no, it sounds good.
Share something about yourself that no one knows about you.
Okay. I did a gig playing bass with Chuck Berry at the Meadowlands in front of 14,000 people with no rehearsal.
Oh, wow. That's good. Being being engaged.
So, yeah, you had to really focus. But I mean, I'm a huge fan. And, that's sort of the pedagogy for rock and roll. I mean, I used to study the famous record, The Great 28, which is sort of all of his hits. He comes out, they introduce him, he gets up on the stage, he turns around to the band and he goes, "You guys know these tunes, right?" We're like, "Yeah, that's why we're here, Chuck. Count it off. Let's go."
Yeah.
And it was a thrill for sure. So,
Did
the continuation of that thought is I have a gig tonight with my Louisiana R&B band, Otis and the Hurricanes.
Yeah.
Doing two sets from 7 to 9 at a little town north of me in Connecticut. So
that's awesome. I hope that people can look at a recording of it by the time this episode comes out.
Yeah, and there's a bunch of YouTube videos of the band, including me performing a tune that I wrote for the band called Alligator Souffle, and it's all on YouTube. So yeah, check it out.
I'll try to put a link in the description so people can see.
Yeah.
That's awesome, though. Did you get into the state of flow when you're on stage with them?
I do, yeah. I mean, I described it as sort of going to the alpha state and forgetting about reality,
Yeah.
And it's my therapy, man. I did it for a living. I was a professional musician for 20 years, toured with a band called McKendree Spring right after college, did 3 albums with them, opened for bands like ZZ Top and the Eagles and Fleetwood Mac. And then was a session guy in New York, lived in Manhattan for 16 years.
Yeah.
And then, so I've had 8 careers so far to follow on the thread of being a nonlinear careerist. Ended up in the jingle business, writing music for television, taught myself to be a web producer, and then, much to my surprise, was hired by IBM
to
join corporate internet programs in 1998 and spent 15 years there, working at Big Blue in a variety of roles, a couple stints at corporate headquarters. And then e-tired about 7 years ago.
Yeah.
And have been working as a kind of consultant, writer, speaker on the future of work topics.
Yeah, it seems that's what you've been building a personal brand around. I was going to make a sharp-dressed man joke at some point because of the ZZ Top.
I love that tune, man.
So
Every girl crazy about a sharp-dressed man.
You know what's interesting is that, like, I know karaoke's not anywhere the same as being on stage per se, but I love that thrill of being able to thrill a crowd and get them all excited through a song and that kind of thing.
Yeah, no, it's fun. It's fun. I enjoy it.
Yeah. So going into the questions here, you recently launched your new course, Future-Proofing Your Data Science Career, just a couple months ago. How does that feel?
It was great. It's sort of a continuation of a theme that I've been developing over the past many, many years, based on my own nonlinear path. I mean, I've had 8 careers so far. So I've codified it into what I call my future career toolkit. And we'll talk more about that later on. But in speaking about this topic, a guy saw me in New York at the Open Data Science Conference. They asked me to give a talk called How to Succeed at Data Science Jobs That Don't Exist Yet. So I put that together for them. And there was a gentleman in the audience who was connected to LinkedIn Learning. This is back to our broader networking conversation, right? And he introduced me to his content manager, and I did a version again of my perspective using the Future Career Toolkit aimed at data scientists. So that's live now. I went out and spent a week in Santa Barbara in January and spent a week on a sound stage reading from a teleprompter, but worked on the content for many, many months to kind of refine it, finesse it, revise it. So that's on LinkedIn Learning now, and I'm excited to have it out there. and
Yeah.
it's been getting some good response. So
Well, and I was telling you before this episode, I do a lot of research for my guests so I can know what you're talking about and have really good questions and whatnots. And I took the course this morning. I wanted to take it sooner, but I didn't get a chance to until this morning. But I made sure I wanted to get through it. And it was really good. And we talked about the nuances, about some of the analogies you made. And I even watched one of your old keynotes as well. And I saw the similarities, and the way you explained it was much more refined, like you said, and you worked on how to deliver it effectively on our online platform.
great. Well, thank you. And I think I mean, it's somewhat of a sidebar, but I think it's germane and even more relevant than it was 6 months ago, now that we're all in COVID land
Yeah.
and that many, many people are being laid off. I mean, I just saw LinkedIn laid off like 900 people, mostly in sales and talent. I mean, it's, people are getting whacked in a lot of different places because business is kind of imploded.
Yeah.
So, all I was saying, at the risk of sounding salesy, this my future career toolkit is a way. It's really discipline agnostic. It's in the context of data science on LinkedIn Learning, but you could jump into it. It's like the third chapter, third course, movie, or whatever. And it's a set of tools that I built based on thinking about codifying how I navigated through these multiple careers over these many years.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too, because kind of going to something that we're going to talk about later too, but like the idea of polymath that we talk about on the show, you have multiple careers. And I think a lot of people by the end of their lifetime, when they get to 90 or 100, they might have had enough careers to actually be considered as a polymath. A lot of
Yeah,
polymaths like Da Vinci or even Steve Jobs, I would consider, and stuff like that. And some of the greater ones out east too, they all had these multiple careers over their lifetime, and they did not consider themselves polymaths. They were labeled that after the fact because of all the careers they had.
yeah. Well, I think again in the sort of 21st century's global borderless workplace paradigm, polymathy is going to be critical, right? And sort of the accepted mode. Some data points I love to cite when I do these workshops at universities are that 85% of the jobs that you're going to do haven't been invented yet.
Mhm.
You being today's learners and your listeners or whatever. The US Bureau of Labor Statistics says that today's learners are going to have 8 to 10 jobs by the time they're 38. And not because they have to, but because they can.
Yeah, or want
And
to.
that's a data point coming from a public sector organization with no agenda. They don't have any philosophy. They just capture the information and share it. So all by way of saying, the intimation is that, learning new skills besides what you know how to do now is going to be an ongoing lifelong process
Yeah.
for today's learners. So
Well,
it's
and
exciting.
yeah, it really is. And one of the things that I talk about a lot too on the content is lifelong learning. I think that is something that everyone should do, no matter what career you're in, because it's important for our brain to be all the neuroplasticity. Not only that, too, just to keep growing and improving.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the good news is there are new models for learning. I mean, you know, I often say people have to stop thinking of education as an event that happened in the past.
Yeah, I love that.
Education is going on. Companies like Degreed are offering amazing models for connecting. Their initial foray was connecting learning management systems in corporate settings to what they describe as publicly available learning assets. Right, so they set up a tool that's an amazing cloud-based tool that lets learners kind of control their own learning, right?
Mhm.
And set up learning pathways. There's a whole social aspect to it. I mean, their manifesto is the future doesn't care how you became an expert.
Yeah.
And that's going to be applicable to, all learners and workers today.
Definitely. And kind of jumping down to another question then, because that reminds me of what I've been talking about with PolyInnovator, this modular education framework. One thing I've been talking about is this idea of modular education, choosing what you learn next or having an AI down the line choose it for you. And
Yeah,
so,
no, yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I mean, again, Degreed, I would encourage your listeners to check it out. You can set up your own personal learning pathway, and it even has sort of an AI instance that'll help you monitor and manage what you've done and how much time you spent and what courses you've taken. But to your idea of sort of modular, educational capabilities, I mean, one of the things Degreed does, and more broadly, tools from like even Coursera or Udacity or Udemy, they make you aware that they're learning sources that are non-traditional. So YouTube, for example, right? TED Talks. There's lots of free courseware on Coursera. Major universities like MIT and Harvard are making courseware available very often for free.
Yeah, the open
Some of it
courseware.
costs money for sure, but TED Talks is a source. I mean, there's lots and lots of ways to get information, and much of it is free.
Yeah. Well, this is fascinating because like I said, I've been trying to find a way to build this system where I might need to go talk to people at Degree and be like, hey, we need to talk because this interesting platform, just to kind of go on a question here to kind of overly not get too tangent sense, but you have a slide share on BYOL or bring your own learning. And I have a different take on that, but I'd like to get your perspective on it. Build your own learning, not bring, but build your own education. So I
Yeah.
took this idea of skill tree based learning or skill trees from video games and try to apply it to learning. So let's say you're playing Spider-Man and you're in this game. You have the web swinging of going to different buildings, you have the combat, and then you have chemistry, these different skill trees in the game. The farther down you go, the more stuff you can do within the game. What if we took that into a module sense? So you're taking a course, carpentry, for example, and you want to learn how to cut, what type of wood there is, what can you build with that? And you need to know each of these different areas, but who's to say you need to learn in this linear order? And not to mention, too, we talked about getting into the flow state, getting a more alpha state. You get that through engagement and trying to be interested. So choosing which path you take and having that choice, the power of choice, I think is super important.
Yeah. The other thing I would say is that I think people need to keep in mind tactical applications of this sort of freedom of learning, right? So there's another company name dropping called Burning Glass Technologies, and they do real-time analytics of job and skill needs. They do it across the US, they do it globally. They did a report connected to work led by the World Economic Forum and LinkedIn, capturing where trending is around skill needs. So again, as learners, you being listeners, watchers, whatever, um, you need to develop a system, and that part of that's in my toolkit as well. But being aware of where skill needs are going, driven by evolving business models, right?
Mhm.
So with any luck, none of us is doing jobs that were primary in the 18th or 19th century, even maybe aspects of the 20th century. We want to be doing jobs that are in the available and driving value and generating remuneration in the 21st century. So the way to do that is to keep on top of trending in technology and business models, what's going on in R&D labs, what are universities doing. I always say, like, chase the maelstrom, find the chaos, go for the mayhem.
Yeah.
So look for where people don't know what it is yet. And that's where you can contribute. You're going to have to probably identify what the skills gap is. You'll have certain set of transferable skills, but you're going to need to learn something new as well. But that's where it's interesting, and that's where you'll be employed, and do that to get your next job and do it again to get the job after that.
Well, and I've been definitely seeing a lot of articles crop up over the past few years about employability skills such as critical thinking or clear communication, being able to articulate your ideas in a much more effective way, and even just management of others. There's those basic emotional intelligence skills that people often don't always have when they're getting employed. And so there's a lot of schools trying to build that up, or boot camps for coding to try to teach those skills as well at the same time. It is interesting how those are the transferable skills you can have, but not everyone has those too.
Yeah. So I have to share this anecdote. When I went into interview at IBM,
Mhm.
I had been in the jingle biz about 5 or 6 years. I've been in the web biz about 2 or 3 years. And I gave the vice president of corporate internet programs my resume. I never thought I would do it, but I kind of did it as a favor to a friend, a woman that I'd met on the train who worked at IBM. Anyway, I launched it to my disclaimer. I was a professional musician. I toured with Robert Palmer and played with Bo Diddley and did a lot of records and wrote a lot of music for television. And she said, no, it's okay, I get it. She said, the qualities that made you successful as a freelance musician in Manhattan will make you successful at IBM.
Mhm.
She said, you're going to have to be a creative problem solver. You're going to have to be resourceful and resilient. You're going to have to be comfortable with ambiguity. You're going to have to be able to work across disciplines. You're going to have to be aware of your role as a global citizen. Can you start next week? I was like, what? What do you say?
Yeah.
So she got it. She understood that I had this set of meta skills that would be applicable in the setting of being a corporate internet programs account manager talking to business execs with big P&Ls about how they needed to conform to both design and technical standards in order to get a IBM.com URL.
Yeah.
So again, the idea is those are skills that are universal that today's learners need to be aware of and can refine and revise and update and improve.
There's probably a matter of self-awareness too. Like you were kind of surprised when that person told you about that. I heard you
I
say that
was.
little story in a different podcast at one point, and it made me think about how my first job was a lifeguard. And a lot of the skills I learned from that has applied to almost every other job I've had. My
Yeah, yeah.
instincts, for example. There was one day the instincts of going in and saving somebody where you're just responding right away. You're not overthinking about it. Should I jump in? You're just going. If you don't know, go is the saying they often said. And then a couple years later,
Yeah.
I was a cashier and this plastic bag was on the counter and it fell off the counter and I jumped down to grab it, even though there was nothing in it or like that. But my instincts are like, I need to save this bag from touching the floor for some reason. And those instincts are still there. And some of the stuff I learned too, like focus and staying consistent with certain habits, that kind of thing was those meta
Yeah.
skills, like you mentioned.
Yeah. I think, encourage people to think about the sort of transferable skills that they have that they may or may not be consciously aware of, or things that they've learned over the course of their careers or lives or education or whatever, and realize that they have a lot of skills that are applicable in different settings than the one they're in now,
Mm-hmm.
right? That they can take a lot of that kind of experience and move it into a new setting. In this case, maybe a new job,
Yeah.
a new career.
So let's talk again about the course then. How did you perceive people acting upon it? Let's talk about the toolkit then.
It's sort of a codified perspective on how I went from being like a touring rock musician to working at IBM, and with a bunch of stops in between. I wanted to put together something that was tactical and actionable,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, these sort of lessons, this guidance, I describe it as being burnished in the crucible. Like, I didn't read a lot of academic papers about this. I schlepped around New York in the rain with my cassette tape, trying to get producers to hire me to play on their record or their jingle so I could pay the Con Ed bill, right? Get the utilities, keep the heat on in the loft.
Yeah.
So the tools are designed around what I call the future career tools are voice, antenna, and mesh. And we could go through this if you want, but the meta perspective is voice is kind of your brand writ large. What is it that you do that no one else can do, that you enjoy doing, that you're passionate about? And it's going to change and morph. I mean, mine's changed sort of 8 different times so far. The antenna piece is we now have the tools to find out where conversations are going on around the topics you've teased out around what you're interested in and where your skills are. Lots of different sources. I mean, I always say the good news is there are lots of ways to track down information about a topic you're interested in. The bad news is there are lots of ways to track down topics you're interested in where conversations are going on. So managing it and doing triage on it is certainly challenging, keeping track of what you're going to listen to and when. But the good news is there are lots of ways to kind of get this information. And the third piece is mesh, which I think of as sort of a 3D data visualization. It's like your network on steroids. And again, it's an ongoing process, but tracking down the actual people and companies and organizations that are doing interesting work in the fields you identified in your voice exercise, if you will. And tools like LinkedIn, are invaluable for this kind of thing. But other, social media tools or websites or blogs or whatever, there's lots of ways to find the actual people. And with a little, resourcefulness, you can get to these people and let them know who you are, get on their proverbial radar. So when an opportunity arises in a field you're interested in where you have talent, they think of you, let's call that guy that reached for me on LinkedIn last week or 6 months ago or whatever. He or she had talent that would fit into this role or into this new organization that we're putting together or whatever.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too because they say that you're only 3 people away from the people you want to reach too. So if there's someone who's a little bit out of your reach right now, make more connections. And like you say a lot on either in the course and other shows is that every week you should try to make 3 to 5 new connections and treat it as a job because those new connections may end up being your job down the line. And it's interesting too because you're talking about the antenna of those toolkit there, and it reminded me of something we talked about before the episode: the second brain concept, having that database for your brain in online, or even just a CRM, as you've often said too, and trying to organize this in a digital way so you don't have to keep memorizing everything and getting overwhelmed by that.
Yeah, I mean, this is somewhat tangential, but I'm a big CRM fan for sure. I mean, I first learned how to use one when I was repping a jingle house in New York. I used this tool called ACT, but the one I currently use is called Less Annoying CRM. And it was built by these two kids. They're now not kids anymore, but who went to Wash U in St. Louis, actually, Missouri, go Missouri.
Yeah.
And it's cloud-based, and it's operating system agnostic, and it runs on your phone. It's really a great tool because you're going to need to keep track of who you spoke to, when, and what they said, and who they're connected to. And unfortunately, LinkedIn doesn't let you easily export your contacts or the information related to it. I think probably the recruiter version does, but the regular standalone, even the premium version won't. So, but you need a way, again, this is my admonition to listeners, to keep track of who you're talking to
Yeah, definitely.
and when to talk to them again and what to send them and what you sent them, and
Oh yeah.
put them in groups, and you can build pipelines and on and on.
Just a little tangent here. We are talking about my favorite tool, Notion.so, before the episode. And
yeah.
whenever I first started doing these interviews, one of the first things I did was make a CRM in Notion. So I have a database here, the number of people, the name, their email, the title of the episode, date of the interview, status, location, and whatever other information I might need. Even this little formula of like, hey, this is the last time I talked to them. Here's a 3-month check. So once the 3 months are up, it'll change the status. Hey, you need to go talk to this person. I also have it for 6 months later as well. So it's just interesting how, like you're saying, keeping up with people.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, again, that's the meta perspective. It's a numbers game at the end of the day, right? So we used to say in New York, getting the job is the job. And it's not what you know, it's who you know. So the more people that know who you are, the better your odds of getting a job. When I first moved to New York, I reached for Will Lee, he's my favorite electric bass player. He's a legendary cat. He's played on thousands of records, and I met him when I was on the road. He was playing with Horace Silver. I was playing with McKendree Spring. And anyway, I said, Will, I'm in town. What do I do? He said, schedule 6 jam sessions a day and panic to get to the next one. Like, what? He said, and one of them will turn into a gig, and then do 5 jam sessions and a gig. And then you'll get 2 gigs and do 2 gigs and 4 jam sessions. Again, the message is you just got to network. That's how you do it in the music business. You do jam sessions so people know who you are and how you play and what kind of person you are. And that's what I did. And it served me well for 16 years living in the heart of the beast, man.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned earlier too about the pandemic and how we're sitting here, like there's an opportunity to do so much more. If you want to learn data science, there's an IBM cert on Coursera that you could take. I started taking it even. And it's interesting too, because one of the first things I did was make a blog post on saying like, hey, these are stuff you should do during this time to make use of your abnormally extra time. And I started doing interviews. That was my kind of like, someone said recently on the podcast, a COVID resolution. And
I like it. Yeah.
And so my COVID resolution was to do these interviews. And since then, in the past 2.5 months or so, I've done over 30 interviews and have like 5 more scheduled out. And I was doing 6 a week at one point. It was insane.
Wow, great, man. Well,
So
congratulations. I think that's great.
Well, it's like you're saying, they're doing those 6 gigs every week and changing them as much as you need to, but like trying to be hustling and getting things done.
Yeah, building your brand and your visibility as well.
Yeah.
All that for sure.
Going back to the question here, do you mind explaining that trifecta of voice, antenna, and mesh a little bit more?
Well, so the way you start is with voice. And I put this particular exercise together working with an ideation guru, this guy who lives near me here in Connecticut. He has a company called The Growth Engine, and he does sessions for big clients using a whole portfolio of techniques to support creativity and innovation. So some of the techniques he uses are like best worst idea or semantic intuition. So ways to generate creative thinking. And he does it, for clients like Kroger and Walmart and, like Jiffy Pop and whatever. I mean, companies that are looking to innovate and creates, for example, new products and services. So his team developed the Red Velvet Chips Ahoy cookie, right? So stuff like that.
Cool. Yeah.
But anyway, what we do with voice is we ask people to think of their favorite movie or book, TV show, or even game, and think about what the characteristics are that resonate with them. Right? What is it about that particular trigger, if you will, that they find appealing, that makes them feel connected, right? So when we could do that with you. So for me, when I do it, and I did it in the LinkedIn Learning course, the movie for me is Blade Runner 2049, because I'm interested in future technology and its impact on culture and society.
Mm-hmm.
And the book I chose was a book by Ruchir Sharma, Rise and Fall of Nations, because I'm interested in global economics, because at the end of the day, it's all about business, whether we like it or not. But I mean, back to the book, here we'll do a little plug for Philip Coggan's book,
Yes.
right? The History of the World Economy, the Ironies of the Information. So it's the world economy, whether you're making stone tools or you're sharing crypto assets using the blockchain. It's all about how you're creating and storing and distributing value. So that's kind of what the voice exercise is, and it lets you tease out sort of triggers that you can then take into the second tool, which is the antenna piece.
Yeah, why don't we do it for me then? Let's
All right.
plug that in.
So tell me a favorite movie, book, TV show, or game. And it can be recent, it can be from your childhood, or there's no temporal guidelines.
There was a TV show I had in mind, but I can't remember on the top of my head. There is a video game that I really care about, which it's pretty obscure, but it's called The Legend of Dragoon.
Cool. So tell me about that.
Okay, it's a team of heroes. It's one of those RPG kind of games that lasts. It was back on the PlayStation, so 4 different CDs, a long saga kind of thing. And it's just interesting how the challenges they face, oftentimes, there's a lot of tropes and stuff like that, but back in the day, it was still pretty novel. And the way the game was situated, there was these cinematics that were very inspiring and epic in a way. The heroes could turn into these halfling dragon people with like wings and swords and all this magical stuff that was fascinating to me. And I liked how they were able to legitimately change the world through the actions they took.
Yeah. So changing the world. So that's a theme, right? Mm-hmm. And what was the outcome of the game? Like what did they get to when they were done? Can you describe what that might be?
They found challenges throughout family. So the hero had issues with being an orphan, and then by the end of the game, he found out his father was still alive, and they found him. And I don't necessarily super resonate with that, but it is interesting how he found a story of his history and how his family developed and why certain things happened in the way that they did. And he was able to gain closure, I think, because of that.
Yeah. So again, at a meta level, that sort of sounds like problem solving on some level, or and certainly tied to making the world a better place. Mm-hmm. So as a result of finding out that his father was still alive, did he connect, or what was there yet another result that happened at the end of the game? Or?
Not to spoil the game, which I guess it's over 20 years old like at this point. His father actually was possessed by the antagonist of the game, the main, like the Palpatine of that particular universe, so to speak. And so because of that, his actions weren't necessarily his own. And once they got to the final battle, the evil person left his body and the hero was able to be himself again, the father, I mean. And the hero was able to see him for that. And one of the hero's partners throughout the entire journey happened to be his father's like ex-lover. Mind you, his father and that lover were actually thousands of years old comparatively to the modern generation. So that was very interesting as well.
Right. So again, interesting. I mean, at a meta level, it's something sort of problem solving and investigating options to get to something that leads to a good outcome. So that's a big picture thing. Maybe tied more closely to genealogy, or I mean, was that aspect of it interesting to you, like how families are connected, or how people in society are connected?
I think the real big thing I loved about the game was the morals that you learned and the challenges that different people face. I mean, there were certain races in the game, like a giant and hobbits and just different kind of creatures who were not necessarily treated equally. And there was a whole kind of race between these people who had wings, people who didn't have wings. I feel like I'm going on a tangent here, but essentially,
no. I think that's right.
Yeah, and I think that kind of moral and having equality and having the team never really cared about that. The actual heroes only cared about getting the job done and making sure that the positive change occurred.
Right. So that said, again, I'm thinking about how we might use the tools. You might consider, I think of Black Lives Matter. I
Mhm.
mean, I think of issues today where people are looking at injustice from racial discrimination to gender parity issues to serving disintermediated or underserved communities. I mean, so maybe there's an opportunity for you to look to where those conversations are going on,
Mm.
right? And even if it's um, initially done as a sidebar project, it might lead you to some kind of career or job or side hustle or whatever.
Yeah.
So the right, does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Well, and one thing I might add too is that when I started my first blog back in 2011, ever since then, on every chance I've gotten, I use this hashtag make a change. And that particular hashtag has been very relevant to me and important to me over these past 10 years.
There you go. So I think we found it. So using that as triggers, I would say, let's talk about antenna, which is where are those conversations going on?
Mm.
Like where are people, where's the make a change happening? And thinking about, I mean, you had said sort of genealogy, but you might lock onto a current area of focus. It might be Black Lives Matter. I don't know if that would resonate with you, or issues around gender parity, or kids being put in cages at the border, or I mean, on and on. There are lots of places where those conversations are going on. What you might do is look initially for people or sources of those conversations and use that to winnow down where you'd wanted to focus even further, right? So
Mhm.
I'm sure there are bloggers that are writing about, say, Black Lives Matter or gender parity. Certainly, think tanks like New America, Anne-Marie Slaughter, who's the CEO, is very focused on gender parity. Even Melinda Gates, right, at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I mean, she is focused on getting more women involved in tech, for example. So you might make a list of, half a dozen of those kinds of topics and look for where people are having those conversations. It might be blogs, it might be YouTube videos, it might be tweets,
Yeah.
right? It might be websites, op-eds, right? It could be Instagram posts. I mean, it could be LinkedIn published articles
There's even
uh,
some podcasts on matchmaker.fm.
or
And
podcasts for sure.
yeah, well, and one thing I've actually been trying to do is actively try to get more diversity in the guests on the show and try to get more women in tech, for example. Women in STEM is a good example, or people of different colors and just different ethnicities and backgrounds. So we get a
Yeah,
more diverse pool of knowledge and
yeah.
experience.
So, and maybe you could be the podcast guy that covers the make a change, those kinds of topics more. Not to say you shouldn't do the polymathic thing, which I think is great as well. Maybe you do both, or maybe you weave the two together somehow. And I don't know how off the top of my head, but it sounds like you've got some ideas about how you might do that, right?
Mhm.
The make a change slash polymath kind of concept. So I think that's right. There's certainly podcasts going on. So tracking down those conversations. And the one qualifier I say to people is, in addition to identifying the sources, you want to, part of the triage or the analysis or the rationalization is how often do you check them, right? So
Yeah.
maybe you find a really cool blog and it comes out every 10 days, or maybe there's an op-ed in the New York Times, you check the opinion section every day to see if there's something that's relevant. Maybe there's a monthly piece by John Hagel or Anne-Marie Slaughter or somebody, and just sort of to help you manage longitudinally, right, temporally, what content you're looking at and how often.
Hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, using something like a resonance calendar or even not a
Yeah,
CRM, but something along those lines for content as well. Yeah, it's interesting.
yeah, yeah. Give yourself kind of criteria. Put a box around the content to some degree, right?
Yeah, how do we mesh it together more then?
Well, so I would say, I mean, the make a change thing is the next step would be to figure out, where those conversations are going on. And after looking at it for, I mean, I would give it at least a month. You might want to give it longer, but to kind of see again what's resonating, what are you drawn to, what's really attractive to you about what resonates. Like trust your gut,
Mhm.
right? So maybe this topic is not as interesting to you after reading what people are saying about it, writing about it, podcasting about it, but this other topic might be more interesting. So that's the one to focus on and drill down into more deeply. like, okay, so this guy or gal is writing about this. Let me see who else is in that space, right?
Yeah.
Give it a month to kind of figure out what it is.
Go,
And
go on their Twitter profile, see who they're following, who they're following.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do use the Twitter math for sure.
Yeah.
We have the technology. Who do they follow? Who do they think is important talking about interesting about this topic?
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
And then
and
well, go ahead.
I was just going to say, part of one thing that's been motivating me is this education space, because I personally had an issue with trying to find a degree or education system that suited me. I don't know if it's because of the interdisciplinary aspect of my life or just the fact that I wanted to work in an area, smart city development, that hadn't actually, there wasn't any courses or degrees on that at the time of me looking for college. And so I tried to pursue my own education pathway because of that. But I know there's other people like me who couldn't fit into the traditional learning environment. Either they had ADHD or they're polymathic or both, or even just the topic that they wanted wasn't around. Future
Yeah.
job that they wanted, the career that they wanted to go into wasn't around to learn.
Yeah. Or the way they were taught, right? I mean, some
Mm.
people are, visual learners. Some are more comfortable with kind of rote learning. But I think, again, the beauty nowadays is that there are lots of different ways to learn, lots of different modalities for learning,
Mm-hmm.
visual or a written word, and there's social aspects like MOOCs, right, where there's
Yeah.
a social interaction connected to the learning experience, virtual and in person. I think in person, is in question now given the COVID situation. But again, there are lots and lots of ways to acquire knowledge. Again, think of the degreed mantra, right? That the future doesn't care how you became an expert, and that they would say the dam is broken, the levee is down. That learners are now in control of what they learn and how they learn it. So I would
Definitely.
encourage you and your listeners or watchers to take control.
Yeah. Well, thank you for going through that with me, Chris. That was fantastic.
Yeah, well, and then just the following piece,
Yeah.
the mesh piece is now once you've gotten a sense of where these conversations are, the next tool is to figure out who the actual people are and or the organizations where these conversations are top of mind,
Mm-hmm.
that are either driving business models, generating attributable revenue, or that are positioning these organizations as thought leaders in this conversation space. So you might be pleasantly surprised. You might find thought leaders at Microsoft that are really focused. In fact, they just announced an initiative to reskill 25 million people. Think about that, 25 million people that have been impacted by COVID or that are in a situation where they've been furloughed or laid off or part of a resource action or dumped or fired or whatever. But to help those people, acquire new skills so they can be employable and valuable contributors to society and culture and business, right? So I'm sure there are people in that organization that are having the kinds of conversations that you might be interested in based on what we just described. So track down those people, reach for those people, send them a LinkedIn in-mail, or find them on Twitter or wherever else they're posting content or where their contact information is available, and say, I'm really interested in what you're doing. I'd like to have a 15-minute Zoom call with you to introduce myself and
Yeah.
talk about what you're doing and what I'm doing. And that's how it works. And be, unrelenting. Again, as we talked about before, my admonition, especially to Gen Z learners and early career millennials, is add 5 people a week to your LinkedIn profile. And LinkedIn, by the way, is the lingua franca. It's the coin of the realm. You've got to have a LinkedIn profile, and you need to pimp it out and make it as interesting and entertaining as you possibly can. But if you get to Friday at 5 o'clock, so here we are 2 hours on the East Coast from 5 o'clock, if it arrives and you haven't added 5 people, get on it. Make it a job. This is me wagging my senior finger at you. Do it. And because that's how it works. You've got to let people know what you're interested in, what you're passionate about, and people who are in positions to be influenced by you and or hire you. I mean, let's be crass. People who have headcount or have a budget or whatever.
The recruiters are on the platform.
Yeah, I mean, that's how you're going to get a job.
Well, and at this point, you really can't not be on there. It's basically your online resume. There's one other tool I would actually recommend is crash.co. It's a really cool
Yeah.
website that basically allows you to pitch the company. So if I wanted to go work at Microsoft for a particular job, you find a recruiter's email and you pitch them with a video and an example doing the job directly to that person. It's very more direct.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, but more the merrier. Again, I think LinkedIn is kind of the de facto standard these days, right? I
Mhm.
think there's like 260 million people on LinkedIn. So your odds are good.
Just on a little sidebar, I was looking at my follower metrics, which is one of those things it's more superficial. It's not really that important. But
No, that's
on
good.
Instagram and Twitter, it's around 369 at this point, and it's not really much. But on LinkedIn, it's 788. So it's like, oh,
Cool.
that's really interesting. Yeah, how that's.
Yeah. No, that's great.
Now,
Cool.
one other kind of thing besides LinkedIn to kind of build up your network, I think that personal branding is very important. What do you see the importance of personal branding?
Yeah. So again, I would say nowadays everybody has a brand, right? Whether you like it
Mhm.
or not.
Yeah.
I remember doing a workshop in a high school upstate New York, and a kid came up to me afterwards, like a 14-year-old boy, and he said, I don't really think I have a brand. I mean, I'm only 14 and whatever. I said, well, do you have a Facebook page? He said, yeah. I said, well, then you have a brand. I said, everything you, certainly whatever you post on Facebook, but however you dress, what you wear, what you say, how you interact with teachers in the hall, what you say to peers or colleagues or whatever, if you're on a sports team. I mean, it's all part of your brand, right? And who you are and what you bring to the world. And it's something that's going to evolve and change for sure. You need to be aware of that. It's not a static thing. Um, but it used to be that, maybe only movie stars or athletes or famous politicians or whatever had a brand. But nowadays, everybody has a brand. A very visionary marketing exec at the top of the marketing function at IBM used to say that IBM is experienced through the IBMer.
Mhm.
And I think he was right. And everyone's brand, what they bring to the marketplace, if you will, it's like product development. You need to be aware of how you're represented, what you're saying, what you're writing, what you're doing, who you're connected to. One of the things I say to people as they tweak their LinkedIn profile is not only do you want to add information about experiences you've had or places you've been or content you've created, digital assets, work products, whatever. But what people look at also is two other things that often get overlooked. One is who you follow and what groups you're in, right?
Mhm.
So who you follow indicates your level of savviness about the discipline that you're focused on, right?
Yeah.
So if you follow Bill Gates, then it's obvious you're aware of the power of philanthropy.
Mhm.
Um, so you want to make sure that the people you follow that are represented in your profile align with your brand. And in terms of groups, they look at what groups are you in. So are you in, Betty Crocker's cooking soiree, or are you like part of, innovative philanthropic thinkers?
Yeah.
So I encourage your listeners and watchers to be aware of that. Again, all of that reflects on your brand at a meta level. So keep that in mind.
Well, and people often hear the word brand and think of it too much in the business context, but all that really, personal brand really means is just an online reputation, how people perceive you.
Yeah,
And you have to market it. You have to market yourself. You have to be able to share the world like, hey, this is what I'm doing. And even if you're
yeah,
not consciously creating content about it, like you said, the meta brand of it and how people perceive your actions, who do you follow, what groups are you in, like you're saying. Yeah.
yeah. Because the implications are what your skills and talents are, right? Back to the future of work conversation, right? So that's how they're going to gauge your viability as a potential employee or someone to start a company with or someone to be a business partner or to be part of your supply chain or your broader business ecosystem or whatever. It's all part of how they perceive you, right? So,
Well, and I love this whole idea of a multi-model careerist because at this point, you are organizing the way you've done your careers in a unique way. And one thing I think you would really resonate with is actually the reason why I made PolyInnovator for multiple reasons for the most part. But for the main reason is that I wanted to build a foundation for all the careers that I know I want to do down the line. Of course, those things are going to change, and you can't predict the future per se exactly what you're going to do, but you can try to plan for it. So each of the phases of PolyInnovator are going to correlate with the careers that I want to do.
yeah. And I think, again, your idea of the poly innovator is perfect for this new model because people are going to have to learn new skills and apply them in new settings. So that's a polymathic implication, right? The days of going to work at IBM for 30 years are done.
Mhm.
Nobody's doing that anymore. I mean, typical years of service now is like 18 months to 3 years. And certainly in emerging markets, I mean, I remember when I was at IBM, people working for the company like in India or Eastern Europe or even in Asia, they do it for like 2 or 3 years to get the
Yeah.
5 bar or 6, 9 bar logo on their resume, and then they're gone. They're on to the next thing. They do something else that's more interesting or pays better, or is someplace where their friends went or whatever. So the idea of polymathic at a meta level is like be prepared to do things you don't do now
Hmm.
and learn this. You'll be able to transfer some of the skills you have now, but there's going to be a delta. You're going to have to learn new skills that may be not in your comfort zone or in an area where you ever thought you would study or be interested. But that's going to happen. It's going to happen over and over. So again, think like a genius. That's sort of
Yeah.
what I always say, right?
Yeah. Well, and just like when you were on stage, like we talked about in the story in the beginning of the podcast, Polycast, where you had to go on stage and like he's like, "Do you know the song, right? You know the tunes," and you're like, "Yeah." And you were out of your comfort zone. You had to get into the state of flow, and you had to get into a very uncomfortable state because maybe you were in the zone, so you're able to do it without worrying about it. But you had to get out of your comfort zone to do that. And
Well, I think the key is that it's always a combination, right? So
mhm,
it's some skills you have and some skills you don't have. And
mhm,
that's what I've discovered over these many, many years of kind of reinventing myself. What do I know how to do? What do I not know how to do? How am I going to figure out how to do that? And then figuring it out and then moving on. So, an example I give is when I was in the jingle business, for example,
mhm,
there are a set of skills, a set of actors, right? So, there's a guitar player and a singer and a copyist and a recording engineer. But there was always a client and a budget and deliverable, right? So in the when I decided I wanted to be in the web biz, I took those meta skills and transferred them. So in the web production business, there's a copywriter and a scripter and a coder and a graphic designer
mhm.
and someone maybe developing a web app or whatever, and a client and a budget and deliverable. So I learned the skills that each of those actors had enough to be able to articulate to them, well, the hexadecimal for that color is not on brand. So you've got to
Yeah.
like, change it so that the client is happy when they get here to see the website. So again, meta skills. So I studied, I read a lot of books, I learned HTML, I stayed up late looking at source code on websites. How do they put this together? How does this work? How do they put images in a site or whatever. And then I was able to transfer those skills to a new set of actors and do something new. So some stuff I knew how to do, some stuff I had to learn how to do.
Well,
And I've done that sort of over and over.
yeah, well, it seemed like you almost took a project manager approach where you're able to have your hands on all these different cookie jars like a polymathic person would,
Yeah.
and you were able to translate like the knowledge from one area to another to be able to communicate that. Like, hey, this person's more front end, this person's more back end, but they can't communicate right now. I could be the bridge between those two people.
Yes, for sure. Definitely that. Yeah. And again, figuring out sort of what the skills were that I'd need to speak to run a big project like that and deal with a client where the deliverable was not a jingle, but it was a website or a web
Mhm.
application or whatever. And
Well, it made me think about you were recently on David Yakopovich's podcast, the Humane podcast, and he was a guest on my show actually, so it's kind of meta there. But he was talking about how you can't really learn a skill just by like retaining the knowledge. You have to actually go and apply it. You have to like try to do it in some way, shape, or form to really learn it.
yeah,
And I think that kind of relates to what we're saying here.
yeah, no, for sure. I totally agree. And I had some early days when I hung out a shingle as a web producer. There were some lean times, just saying. I mean, as I sort of tried out the skills in the marketplace, and there was some crazy politics, and graphic designer I hired sort of took over the account for this one website, and on and on. But the more you do it, the more comfortable you get, the better you get at it. And as I say, I ended up at IBM with big internal clients with big P&Ls. And the interesting part of that was that as we, this account manager team, were sort of assigned clients out into the business, these execs who realized they could actually sell stuff with this goofy web thing had us involved in developing like management consulting kinds of roles and putting together like business plans and up to and including merger and acquisition targets. So it was
Yeah.
interesting. I'd never done any of that before. So I had to learn how to write a business plan and develop a strategy to acquire a company and that kind of thing. So
Yeah. Well, back to one of the questions here, because it reminds me, you were talking about how careers, you're not going to be staying at a company for 30 years anymore. That's just not how things work anymore. And it seems like many companies in Silicon Valley, for example, especially like Google, actually prefer you to have experience in many different companies. Uh, and so how do you think to get ready for that 8 to 10 jobs, at least, like you said, a lot, or at least in your mentality, I guess you could say?
Well, so I think it's again, it's a couple of things. One thing I want to cite this really great interview that Thomas Friedman, the New York Times author and op-ed writer, did with Laszlo Bock. It's a two-part series. It was in the New York Times. It's a few years ago now. Laszlo Bock was the chief people officer at Google, right?
Mm-hmm.
But Thomas Friedman was basically pressing him, and how do you hire? What does it take to be a Googler? Like, what are
Mm-hmm.
the criteria you look for? And Laszlo Bock, among other things, described sort of 8 criteria. One of the things that he said right off the top of this interview was, we don't look at GPAs or standardized test scores. He said, they don't tell us anything we need to know. And we don't really look at skills or expertise. Now, that said, they have legions of coders, in Mountain View, developing and refining search and Google Docs and whatever. But again, their meta perspective is they want people who can just do what I described at IBM, right? The woman who hired me at IBM, like meta skills. So connecting dots in unusual and interesting ways, like seeing connection points between information that may seem orthogonal, but actually has value if you can see how they might be connected or leveraged or used, right?
Mm-hmm.
He talked about things like emergent leadership, which is, in his mind, is where you can conjure and articulate a strategy or an approach to get to end of job, but then acquiesce if someone else on the team has a better idea, or say, well, maybe my idea would fit into your solution in this kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
And being able to sort of being humbled, being able to say, well, my solution didn't work, and not blaming somebody. Well, it wouldn't work unless you had fixed it or whatever, or taking credit when something's successful. The vice versa of that, right? Well, it worked because my idea was so great.
Mm-hmm.
So, because all these work environments now are sort of collaborative and community driven, right? So that's one thing I would say about that, right? Um, Looking at the portfolio of products and services at innovative companies is changing so fast that people with niche skills generally are not going to be desirable. They're going to want people who know how to do something for sure, but are ready to learn, ready to open to understanding where the portfolio is going and how they might contribute to conjuring a new model or generating a new set of products and services that are going to drive attributable revenue that are going to keep Wall Street happy and shareholders, right? Contribute to EPS, earnings per share. So
Yeah. Well, it seems like not only in the past couple of decades, but especially even right now and during COVID, especially, that there's a lot of need for a new way of doing work. And so this kind of leads me to another question here about the concept of work has changed over the past few hundred years, but especially since the Industrial Revolution. Where do you see that concept evolving now?
well, I think, and again, I have to say, I learned this at IBM. I think it's happening more and more at other companies. Is that they give you the work, the challenge, the problem or whatever, and then it's up to you to do it at the level of quality that they expect, and to do it wherever and whenever you can.
Mm-hmm.
If you can do it in Starbucks, or you can do it on the train commuting into the city, or if you can do it in your pajamas on your porch or whatever. The expectation is that you figure out what needs to be done and how to do it, and who you need to work with as well. So who on the team writ large can help you get to end of job. And beyond that, it's kind of like, okay, at IBM, it was like, we hired you because you can do this. And if you have a question or a problem, let me know. But otherwise, I got other things to do. I have
Yeah.
other teams I'm running or other problems I'm solving. So, and I think, to be fair, millennials are much more gated that way than, say, people from my generation, right? That they're
Yeah.
comfortable doing it wherever and whenever. There's a great story about some millennial being managed by a boomer or whatever, and doing his work and sort of the assignment in 20 hours. And the boomer saying, well, I took 40 hours to get, to get to end of job. And the millennial's like, I'm sorry it took you so long to get that sorted out, but I'm out of here.
Yeah. Well, and with the rise of technology too, like me and my generation and the Gen Z generation, and even probably Gen Alpha as well, we're so digitally native. I grew up building computers when I was 10.
Yeah,
I was lucky because I had a techie family who were able to do that. And there's plenty of people my age who don't know how to use a computer. But it is
yeah,
interesting how just digitally native we've become. There was a video of a 3-year-old literally trying to play with a Game Boy, one of the original
right,
Game Boys, and trying to touch the screen because she literally could not fathom the fact that you had to use buttons for it.
right. Well, another story is there's a baby like looking at a magazine and trying to swipe the pages to get to the next, and being frustrated that the magazine didn't move. You're so
Oh
used to like
man,
moving through content that way, you know.
yeah. Well, and you're kind of alluding to this idea of what being interdisciplinary, and I think that like, I've been talking to people about how work has been specialized for specialists. We've been cultivating that whole specialist society, and throughout every generation, there's been these polymathic people who've been kind of stifled in a way. And it's my belief that polymaths have not been able to be fruitful in the past 100 years, despite the fact that they were beforehand, and even sort of now with entrepreneurs. What do you think the future of work will alleviate that kind of polymathy in the workplace? We kind of touched on that a bit, but
Yeah, no, but I think it's gonna be true in large enterprises where they're going to expect people, employees, workers to be more creative, more multifaceted, more multi-talented. Certainly, if you want to stay employed and even move through the ranks of management or whatever.
yeah,
And I think the flip side is sort of at startups. So many polymathic types have opportunities to start companies and sell companies and start another company, or work in settings where the ability to be polymathic and have multiple perspectives or skills is rewarded as opposed to suppressed, or not valued.
mm-hmm. It almost seems like they're suited for that intrapreneur mindset in a way.
Yeah, I mean, entrepreneur, again, it takes the right setting. So
Mm-hmm.
you're probably not going to be rewarded as a polymathic entrepreneur at, like, with all due respect, a large insurance company or something. I mean, I remember a great story about I was in this session and a guy who was a senior executive insurance company. They'd hired a young woman to kind of run their social media. Um, and so she did it like as an intern one summer, and they offered her a job. And she turned it down. They're like, well, don't you want to work for Company X? We're a big, prestigious insurance company. She's like, well, you guys don't understand the value of social media. So why would I stay here and be frustrated by your lack of awareness of the value of this new tool? So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and the guy's like, what? You're kidding. You don't want to work for us? We're like Company X. We're like highly regarded. Like, no,
yeah.
I'm out of here.
I
So,
feel I don't know. This is just me being stoic or callous, but I feel like companies who aren't able to adapt like that, or at the very least be open to adapt, shouldn't necessarily stick around. Like banks are a good example where they've been nailed out so many times. And I'm not against bailing out big companies and whatnot if we need to. But yeah, sure, whatever the reason may be. But if they're needed to be bailed out because they're not able to adapt for some reason or another, then they probably should be left to the
yeah.
wayside. I feel like.
Well, I think, two factors. I mean, the market will determine it and employees will determine it, right? So if they're not bringing value to the marketplace, Adam Smith, the invisible hand, right? If they're not selling stuff that people want to buy,
Yeah.
then that's a going out of business strategy. And by the same token, the flip side is if they're not doing something interesting or innovative or thought provoking or that's enticing to employees, people aren't going to want to work for the company. They're going to work somewhere else where, you know, people are doing something interesting. And back to our sort of make a change theme that we
Mm-hmm.
teased out. I mean, the research says that certainly millennials and Gen Z even more, will not work at a company, or not necessarily will not work, but the percentage is high of those of them from those generations that will not take a job at a company that doesn't have a good record of corporate social responsibility, doing good in the community,
Mm-hmm.
helping the world be a better place. I mean, they'll work for less money at a company that has more of a focus, on those kinds of criteria.
Yeah,
So,
definitely. Pivoting a little bit, concept we talked about a lot today is polymathy. So something I ask all my guests on the show is, what is a polymath to you?
what is a polymath to me?
Mm-hmm.
I think it varies. I mean, I think people are intimidated by the term to some degree because when they think polymath, they think about Leonardo da Vinci or Benjamin Franklin or the classic examples of people who had multiple skills across very divergent disciplines.
Mhm.
But if you drill down into it and do some sort of research into the historical record, you'll discover that probably more people than you might have thought were polymathic to varying degrees. I mean, Borodin was a composer and a chemist, right? The idea is you don't have to be an expert in physics and be a sculptor in marble and to be able to, memorize a periodic table.
Yeah.
It's like it's okay to have polymathic tendencies, which means skills in maybe 2 or 3 areas that are comparatively divergent or
Mm.
disciplines that don't ostensibly connect. So that's what I would say, encouraging listeners or viewers to think about. You don't have to be Da Vinci, but get in touch with your sort of inner polymath. Like, what is it? Maybe there are a couple of things that you do. Maybe you're a gardener and you're a writer,
Mhm.
or you can do a couple of 3 different things. I remember talking to this millennial at IBM. She was working in corporate headquarters in social media, and her take was, during the day, I do social media for a global 50 company. She had a line into the CEO at the time, Ginny Rometty. She said, in the evenings, I'm a clothing designer. I design and make clothes. And then on the weekends, I'm a DJ.
Mhm.
So that's the polymathic perspective that she had. And it was like, yes, Sam, very cool.
Yeah.
So encouraging people to think, again, more broadly about the multiple skills they have and explore them. And again, thinking that way will help you be successful in a series of nonlinear careers that you're going to have over the course of your work life.
Definitely. And it seems there's also kind of this distinction I always like to employ is between a polymath and like a true polymath. Someone like Da Vinci, who is like he knew about light physics and anatomy and invention and painting. He was someone who's super divergent. But there's also a regular kind of polymath, like the average kind of Joe, who might be someone in similar fields, but they're different masteries or expertise that are
Yeah,
similar in nature. You don't have to be someone who's super divergent to be a polymath.
yeah, no, I agree. It's almost like I think of an analogy could be made to autonomous vehicles, right? There's sort of
Mhm.
levels 1 through 5, right? 5 is the car drives itself and you're asleep in the back seat.
Yeah.
1 is like it gives you lane indicators or blind spot warning. So polymath kinds of skills could cover a range like that. I mean,
It's
maybe you
interesting.
should define it. Maybe you should
I
put
have.
together like, have you?
I,
Oh, okay.
I created like a polymath spectrum. So you have
There
like
you
this
go. Perfect.
multi-potential light, someone who has the potential to do many things, a jack of all
Cool.
trades who's like a novice in many different areas. That term often is a little bit negative connotated, but it just means you're interested in many areas. And then
Yeah.
you have the generalist and a universalist, a polymath and true polymath, that kind of scale of
So where is
expertise.
that? Is that on your website or somewhere? Where can people see that?
I actually am going to be making content about it here soon. I haven't made any particular content yet.
Okay. Yeah.
I want to make sure I define it well because, like I said, some of those terms like generalist or jack of all trades have some kind of negative connotation, especially in
Yeah.
other languages. In Italian, for example, jack of all trades is not really received as well as like a polymath. And there's actually no term for polymath in Italian, despite the fact many Italians we might think of are Italian. That goes back to a point you made earlier, not to go on
Yeah.
a tangent, but there's a lot of great polymaths in each Eastern cultures as well.
Yeah. Actually, there is a term in Italian for polymath.
Mhm.
And it's in the book that I mentioned. I'm working on a book, and one of the chapters is "Think Like a Genius," and I'm going to be pressed to find it, but I'll send it to you. But it's a term. It comes from a book, "The Life of the Courtier," written like in the Renaissance, like in the 15th century, by an Italian author,
Mhm.
and he describes the skills of a polymath in Italian culture.
Hmm.
I could look it up if you want me to, but I don't
Afterwards,
want
we'll
to
talk about it.
digress. But
So, going to one of the questions here is one reason why I asked that question to all my guests is that, in my view, there's a couple ways of becoming a polymath. There's the idea of changing careers throughout your life, and from most people, from what I can tell in my short life, already do this inherently, even if they don't stay with the same company. Like we said earlier, in future work, people aren't going to stay at the same company for 30 years, but for the past 100 years, people have been. And I think I've seen people who have been doing that, even if you're in that same company for 30, 40, 50 years, you're changing your careers and your jobs
yeah,
within that company. And so you end up becoming polymathic by the end of your life. So what are your
yeah.
thoughts on that?
No, I think that's a fair comment for sure. I mean, at IBM, 15 years at IBM, I didn't do the same thing. Obviously,
Mhm.
I mean, I was in corporate internet programs. As I said, I got pulled into a strategy role pretty quickly when these execs with P&Ls, right, big bogeys, discovered they could sell stuff, they could deal with their supply chain, they could interact with business partners, they could have conversation with analysts and journalists using this web thing. This is 1998, right? But I did a lot of different jobs, if you will, or careers. And I think at the right company, you can certainly do that. I mean, big companies, even today, offer talented, ambitious people the ability to navigate through different parts of the company. And IBM is a huge company, and Microsoft and Google as well. So there are chances to do lots of different things within one big company. I would say be careful about the company you pick, though.
Yeah.
Because, and my other admonition to early career workers is, if you have the chance to work at a big corporation like that, like IBM, like Google, like even Microsoft or whatever, I would say do it, but don't do it for very long, right? Do it for like 2 or 3 years. And the reason I say that is because you'll learn things in that setting at a globally distributed company of 400,000 employees, like IBM. The sun never sets on IBM. It's 190 countries, 24/7 cranking. But you'll learn things about the rate and pace at which work is done, the quality that's expected, the ability to manage across a matrix, across a lot of different product lines and people with different kinds of objectives and skills, different disciplines. And it's a fascinating education that you'll get. But I would take those skills and, depending on the company, and I don't mean this to demean big companies, but take those skills and do something else. Go to a business partner, go to some company in the supply chain, start your own company, and then sell it back to the parent company where you worked, or, go to a bunch of startups, be a serial entrepreneur. I mean, it's not for everybody. Some people are comfortable working at a big company. And again, there's the capability to navigate through different parts of the company. But I think generally there's more interesting work going on outside of big companies, and, lots of different, and you can even be what they call a boomerang. I mean, I worked at IBM for a couple of years, left and went to a small systems integrator, worked there for about a year, came back to IBM. So there's lots of more flexibility now in terms of how you work and where you work and when you work.
Well, and this, I was actually going to mention it in a different question we asked earlier, but I've had over a dozen different jobs and over half a dozen different employers over my short work span of life. I've only been working for 8 years now, since I was 17. And ironically, despite the fact of having all those employers, I've had one main employer, the city that I work for, at the recreation center, where I was a lifeguard, a swim instructor, pool manager, a water aerobics instructor, water boot camp, personal trainer, all kinds of different jobs that all were sort of related, but for the most part, different things to do.
Yeah, and I think that's a model for sure that works, definitely. And ideally, even if you're at a big company, you can be part of an innovative product launch or part of a organization, because companies, again, big companies like IBM, they morph and shift and change, and they shut down business units and they start new business units. And I mean, when I was at IBM 10 years ago, they put together an emerging business opportunity, which means they gave funding to an organization to investigate virtual worlds. So I was very active in Second Life. I don't know if you're familiar with those kind of environments. Verbella is the current kind of version of it. And they got 2 years of air cover from a P&L, and they were exploring whether there was like a pony in there. Like, could they make money in this virtual space? And we built sites for Deutsche Bank and for Circuit City and lots of other big clients. It turns out there wasn't. But it was an exciting internal organization that IBM funded and sponsored. And there are lots of those kinds of initiatives that go on at all kinds of big companies. I mean, Google has a whole portfolio, Google X, right, which is their kind of R&D branch. And they fund things like internet sales, balloons, and Clarity, which is their healthcare division, which has contact lenses that detect glucose levels in your bloodstream. And so cool stuff at big companies. IBM Watson, you mentioned that in your earlier notes. Funding. I'm actually going to a quantum workforce webinar on Tuesday that IBM is sponsoring with a bunch of analysts and press, because they just announced the quantum internet roadmap, right, at the University of Chicago a couple of days ago. So anyway, Lots of
Yeah,
interesting stuff.
definitely. And it's interesting. So I'm trying to get one of my friends online. She's a quantum computing expert, and I want to try to get her on the show as well because I think quantum physics and quantum mechanics in general and computing is super interesting in how it's going to evolve. I need to take a look at that roadmap.
Yeah, yeah.
Pivoting a little bit here, between your experience as LinkedIn course creator and your knowledge of use of like virtual worlds for training, where do you see the future of education evolving? Then,
Well, I think education and work as well, right? So
yeah,
in education, we're seeing a major impact because of COVID-19, right? Do people really need to go to classrooms? They actually don't, right?
yeah,
And I mean, tools like MOOCs and even, online courseware from Coursera and edX have kind of been leading the way in that approach, usually for a long time. And I think now, I mean, professors don't want to go to a lecture hall where they risk getting, a disease that could kill them. So
yeah.
and I can't blame them,
A lot
right?
of the professors are probably high risk too.
Well, yeah, for sure. So I think we're going to see more and more adoption, certainly of like what we're doing. I mean, using Zoom, right? That's happening, video conferencing. But I think people exploring virtual worlds. Like I was just at an event called Verbella.
Mm,
It's like a virtual world, like Second Life, like a virtual universe, right? Where you have an avatar and you walk around and you can go to different venues, meeting halls, and smaller rooms. And there's a recreational area. You get in a boat and take a trip. You can climb in a treehouse or whatever. I think we're going to see more and more of that. I think virtual reality as well is going to be adopted more widely. They've really got to get the price of the headsets down, though. I mean, it's
yeah,
still you really need to spend $400 to get a reasonable experience. I'm a huge fan of VR. I mean, the ability to be in an immersive environment with other people is fantastic, but it's just too expensive.
yeah. You don't have a
And
gaming PC, do you?
I don't know.
Yeah, and you kind of need one of those to really power it. Sorry to interrupt there, but
Yeah, no, no, and they're making standalone headsets that don't
yeah,
require, but I think that will, again, this pandemic is going to drive science writ large, and in terms of technology, more specifically, things like VR and AR. I'm a big AR fan as well. So they're going to be new models. It'll be driven by technology, and also opportunities for content creation. I mean, instructional designers are going to have to rethink how they put together curriculum. These poor teachers that had to take lesson plans that they had in paper notebooks
mm,
and now, recast them, flow them into some way to deliver it in a virtual environment. I mean, it's very challenging.
yeah.
So again, creative problem solvers are going to figure out how to do this, and they're already working on it. So
So
kudos to them.
my
Yeah.
that's the whole like that's what I was talking about earlier. That modular education framework. That's what I'm trying to do is change how we approach the pedagogy and the experience of learning online.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a hybrid model for sure, as it sort of always has been. I think they're going to be use cases that work better in different settings with different technologies, some better than others, right? I mean, VR is great for an immersive, transformational kind of experience. I think for more rote kinds of things like, with all due respect, learning data science or
Mm,
that there are situations where you can just do a voiceover and show someone what the code looks like and here's how you put it together. You don't need to have a headset walking around in a
yeah.
3D rendering of like financial data or whatever to
Well, and
get the
data science
point.
is fascinating too, considering the boundless potential of it.
Yes, and it's impacting everything just the way AI is, right? So,
Hmm.
I mean, again, at a meta level, every company today is a technology company, whether they like it or not.
Yeah.
They've got to be dealing with it on some level.
Well, and you've been mentioning the word meta a lot, and it's something that I've always really loved with like metaphysics. And even my last guest, we talked about the Mir. She was talking about how she loves meta anything in a way. One of your specialties is meta cognitive learning strategies. So, can you tell me and the audience a little bit more about that?
So the original version of my Future Career Toolkit was called Metacognition and Reinvention, the
Mm.
21st Century Career Paradigm. So,
It's a mouthful,
and
huh?
people they're like, that's a mouthful and it sounds too academic, man. You gotta tighten it up and make it more mellifluous. Come on. So that's sort of how the Future Toolkit evolved. But there's actually a machinima of my avatar in Second Life. It's on my YouTube channel that I did. Boy, it's got to be almost 10 years ago. Sort of describing those concepts that way. It's pretty entertaining. I haven't looked at it in a while, but the idea of metacognition, yeah, sort of what drove my early thinking about how I navigated these careers, taking a step back and looking at, again, commonalities and things that were different,
Mhm.
right? So there were definitely some themes that are achievable by metacognition, by stepping back and thinking about what you're thinking about, right? Looking at how you're living,
Mhm.
stepping outside yourself is a whole Buddhist concept as well, right? Looking at how you live. But I think that's key to, again, navigating the multiple careers that are going to be required of today's learners and workers. And not to be afraid of it, to embrace it, to
Yeah.
figure out how to do it.
Figure out how to get out of your comfort zone, so to speak. And just out of curiosity, secret sauce for 21st century careers, is that what it is?
Uh, it's called, yeah, Secret Sauce. Yeah, yeah, that's it.
I'm linking your YouTube in my description as well.
Okay, yeah, it's pretty entertaining. I mean, that's the early days of this kind of thinking. And I was still at IBM. And is there a date on it?
Nine
Did
years
you find
ago.
9 years ago? Yeah,
Yeah,
so
that's crazy.
we're doing this a while, man.
Yeah, I love it. That's when I started doing blogging too. I think there's a lot of commonalities between, I think 2011 was a really good year for content creators as well.
Uh-huh. Yeah, yeah. Secret sauce, man.
Now to your history. We only have a few more questions before we end up wrapping up, but I really want to get into this here. So you have a degree in German literature to touring with a rock band. That's a pretty big dichotomy there. So how did that happen?
Yeah. Well, so again, it ties back to skills and learning. So I went to Bennington College,
Mm-hmm.
which is a small liberal arts school in Vermont. There were 500 kids. It was an all-girls school before I went there. I was the first class of men to go there. There were no sports. The focus was dance. The big dance program. Martha Graham taught there. Bruce Cunningham was there. Carol Channing went to school there. And a focus on multiple skills too. So my best friend was a astrophysicist and a lutenist.
Mm.
So I studied German lit and also minored in music. So I gave a recital with a bunch of different pieces. I started out by playing a sonata for string, bass, and piano, and ended by fronting a 9-piece horn band singing Bet You Didn't Think I Knew How to Rock and Roll, Eric Clapton tune,
Yeah.
Delaney and Bonnie. So that environment encouraged me to explore lots of different, seemingly disconnected disciplines. Minoring in music, I got a chance to audition. So the music thing was I was associate principal contrabass in the Berkshire Symphony, playing classical music, Mozart and Beethoven. I studied jazz with Jimmy Garrison, who was John Coltrane's bass player, legendary jazz saxophone player. He taught there. And then on the weekends, I had a rock band, and we played in ski lodges all over Vermont. So again, polymathic musician, playing lots of different kinds of music. So anyway, after college, I got a chance to audition for this band, McKendree Spring, and I got the gig. They hired me. And 6 months later, I was in Europe jamming with Jeff Beck in Berlin at the Waldbühne. And then we toured England, then did a record at the Manor, Richard Branson studio. Went to London and to mix it at Basing Street Studios. I ran into Mick Jagger on the way to the men's room.
That's funny.
He was mixing Goat's Head Soup downstairs. I was doing my record upstairs. Like, hello, I'm Mick. I said, yeah, I know who you are, man. I'm a huge fan. I have all your records. So again, I think the ability to learn, unlearn, and relearn is how I managed to do that. So that said, I mean, I knew how to play the bass. I knew how to sing and compose and arrange. But getting a pro gig, one of the lessons was that I had to being able to play in front of like 14,000 people, opening for the Eagles, or headlining gigs with this band in front of 3,000 people. It's like you had to focus in a different kind of way.
Yeah.
I mean, this was like the big time. It's gotta be perfect. It's gotta be right. It can't be loose, One of the things that's sort of an example of it is they took me down to the local music store and said, you've got to buy a Fender bass because that's what professionals play. I had a Guild bass. It was fun to play, easy to play, sounded pretty crappy. And so I went down to the local music store in Ithaca, New York, and I bought a Fender jazz bass, and I'll be playing it tonight. It was a 1973 that I bought brand new, and it still sounds great.
That's awesome.
all
Well,
these years later, man.
when you talk, we kind of mentioned this about flow a lot and getting into the zone. I might have to have you back on to talk more about that too, because I think
Okay.
musicians and athletes, especially, are really like not easy examples, but are common examples of people getting into that zone and getting to the groove, as some jazz people say, and stuff like that. So I think it's really fascinating as well. We talked about the alpha state, which is where a lot of that flow gets into, is in that higher state. I was actually listening to the alpha state brainwaves binaural beats while we've been talking too. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
And what is that?
Binaural beats are tones that go back and forth between different earpieces, and so when you're, it's just a super quiet tonality between both sides, and it's supposed to induce certain brainwave states depending on what you're going for.
Oh, send me that information. I'd like to
Yeah,
learn about that.
yeah, definitely. Well,
Yeah.
and I I've always really loved how that worked, and I don't know. I wish I could explain it more, but yeah, I'll send it to you.
Well, no. Yeah, send it to me. I'd like to learn more about it. Yeah, but I mean, the music thing is,
Yeah.
you kind of get to a point where, like for me, I can put the bass playing on automatic pilot and then focus on the singing, like when I'm fronting the band or singing a tune. So it's an amazing experience, actually, to be able to kind of have that dichotomy.
As someone who loves to sing, I've always wanted to play piano as well, but I couldn't figure out how people did that, where I didn't realize it would be just subconscious. Like when I play a computer game, my fingers do the motions on the keyboard without thinking about it. And I'm sure it's
Yeah,
kind of the same way where you're doing the motions on the keyboard without having to think about it. It's a muscle memory of sorts, or even like you said, just getting into the flow and that kind of thing. That's interesting.
yeah, yeah. No, at the
Well,
point I can sort of put the bass playing on hold. I mean, I've been doing it for 50 years, so
yeah.
there's some muscle memory, and then I sort of pay attention. Oh, yeah, yeah, that's working. Okay, and then I can concentrate on singing and emoting.
Yeah. Well, and we were talking about how musicians have to be kind of polymathic in a way where you have to do these. Usually, you're good at multiple instruments if you study music, and there's also this kind of idea of being an expert in music, but necessarily being polymathic in the amount of instruments and areas that you know. And that's where my brand, PolyInnovator, comes into too. It's the polymath of innovation. So it almost makes me think of like, what type of polymath are you too? Are you a musician polymath? Are you innovation polymath? Are you an arts polymath? That kind of thing.
Yeah. Again, I think people should be aware that it cuts a broad swath, right? I look forward to seeing your chart or whatever your organized process, but that, even if you do a couple of things well, or that you're interested in two or three things, you would fall into the broader polymathic category, and that's a good thing.
Yeah,
Because again, it's going to be required to be successful, certainly for younger people in the evolving and emerging, global workplace model,
definitely.
to be able to do lots of different things over the course of your work life.
Well, and speaking of doing lots of different things and understanding skills and being polymathic, you're a bass player, and so it seems that many highly intelligent and or successful people are musicians. And so, where do you see that playing music is in that mindset?
Well, I worked with a lot of musicians in New York who have unique skills that maybe are not necessarily smart per se, and the way we think is smart, but that have unique gifts and talents and a way to channel their energies, in a certain way. Now, that said, there were a lot of musicians at IBM
Mm-hmm.
because I think the math and the computer thing and the music mindset are definitely correlated. Music is creative, but it's also you have to be creative with certain guidelines or strictures. Remember the guys at the union, when you pick up your checks, they'd say, yeah, everybody starts with 5 lines and 4 spaces.
Yeah.
So that's what an empty staff looks like, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or you could say everyone has the same 12 tones. It's 12 notes and they just repeat over and over. Or when you write a good rock song, it's got 3 chords and that's all you need.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so there are sort of strictures and parameters, much like data science, actually, or like computer programming. It's got to work a certain way. I mean, there are guidelines and parameters and some flexibility, obviously, but it's got to work within certain rules or strictures. So being creative within those strictures is what the challenge really is, right?
Yeah. It reminds me of actually one of my principles of balance. My life principle is about this, for a balance between philosophy and science or technology. And I think that that's a very perfect example of what you're talking about. The mathematics is more scientific in a way, and or grounded and analytical. And you have music, which is a little bit more creative, but both of them have to be creative in their own right or detail in their own right. One of the principles you said before the interview was curiosity. So if we talk about that a lot on this show too, what is one of those, what about it do you think you find so important?
I think, we all start out as curious kids, right? Babies
Mm-hmm.
and kids. And then various factors, parents, culture, society, a job maybe, tries to chip away at it and limits your acceptance of being curious. But I think everyone is curious, and I think we need to encourage people to be more curious. And certainly curious people in workplace settings are the ones I think that will be successful. So innovative companies are looking for curious people.
Mm-hmm.
That's how new products and services get developed. That's how new ways of thinking and running businesses evolve. That's how new technologies impact society and culture. It's by people who are curious. So be curious.
Yeah. Do you think curiosity is a muscle then? Like, can you build it?
I think you can build it. Yeah, I think you can sort of try to pull away the strictures that might impede you from thinking in a curious kind of way, like go down a path that is unusual. Read a book about something, a topic you're not particularly interested in, maybe. I encourage people to go to events too. One of my things is like, go to an event that's on a topic that you don't know anything about or where you don't know anybody, and just keep your ears open and see what you learn, see who you meet, see
Yeah.
what you discover, right? So, or attend a webinar. Nowadays we're in COVID land, so sign up for, do a Google search on webinars on topic X,
Mm.
and have topic X be a subject that you're either mildly interested in or know nothing about but think might be interesting, and see what pops up and sign up and be curious, go discover something new.
So one thing that kind of leads me into the next kind of question here too is being curious like that can be fear inducing. Like you may be nervous. Oh, what if the webinar person calls me out if I raise my hand or something along those lines of just being kind of out of their comfort zone. So how do you think we can be fearless, not only in our career, but in life too?
Well, I think, again, certainly in the digital age, you can lurk, you
Mm.
can be invisible, right? You can engage to the degree you want to. But I would encourage you to, after you've lurked for a while, whether it's in a LinkedIn group or following someone's Twitter handle or even at a live event, heaven forbid, when that starts again, be brave, be confident. Some of it is acting as well, right? So put on a persona maybe, and go into the meeting or the webinar or the online session or even in a virtual world, right? And be the curious person. Put on your curious hat.
Yeah.
Put on your curious face, and know that it's back to the idea of sort of looking at yourself, the metacognition thing. So put on your curious actor persona and go to the webinar, go to the meeting, or attend a session, or take a course, or go to a MOOC, or weigh in on a LinkedIn group,
Mm.
and be bold,
Mm.
be fearless.
Not to toot my own horn, but I think I've done that here as an interviewer, is that I've always been a talkative person. And one of my fears was, and started doing these interviews, is that I'm going to overtalk my guests. And I know there's plenty of people like Gary Vee who do that. And he actually got in trouble. I remember watching him one day, who he accidentally talked over Seth Godin, who was very famous, and he got mad about it. But he was able
Yeah.
to like calm him down and whatnot. But it was just one of those things where that's just his kind of natural inclination. So one of the things I told myself was, you need to become an active listener and learn that skill well. And I hope that I've done that well. And I think it's just interesting how you said persona. That's my persona for this, is to be an active listener and be curious about the guest that's here.
Yeah, I think you're doing it.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
So one last question. Or more of a statement kind of thing. You're writing a book. Can you share more on that?
So it's based on my Future Career Toolkit.
Mm-hmm.
It's also going to have my story, and I'm going to use a disclaimer that I'm borrowing from Ray Dalio, the head of Bridgewater, big hedge fund, right, who wrote a book called Principles, really interesting book. But people said, well, why don't you just put it in, because it's pretty interesting. So all the way I was saying, I put it in with the disclaimer that he used, which is, feel free to skip it if you think it's boring, and too much information or whatever. But I mean, I'm going to include some interesting anecdotes about experiences that I've had navigating these multiple paths.
Hmm.
I have a chapter called Think Like a Genius, from which this sprezzatura, the Italian term for polymath,
Yeah,
is
there we go.
included, along with conversations about non-Western, non-traditional, unknown polymaths and how they live their lives and the contributions they've made. Looking to encourage people to be open-minded about how to be successful at these jobs that don't exist yet.
Mm.
And again, based on my sort of take.
Yeah,
So yeah, I'm hoping to finish it by the end of the year.
that's really
And I'm
cool.
not sure if I'm going to self-publish it or not, but I think it's going to be a valuable handbook, if you will. My objective is to create something that's interesting, but also actionable
Yeah.
that you can do something with.
I think the metrics on that now is like 90% of books now are self-published, especially considering how Kindle made it so easy.
Yeah, I think that's probably going to be the model. I mean, I may engage an editor to take a look at it and
Mhm.
or someone to help me with graphic design. But again, the hybrid model seems to be the way to go. You get some
Yeah.
feedback from a lot of professionals who've left publishing houses and gone out and started these companies that help authors create content and publish books. So,
Take the more polymathic approach, dip your hand in multiple cookie jars in a way.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So where can people find you online?
So certainly connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm always open to making connections. There's another Christopher Bishop who's actually a data scientist who works for Microsoft
I
and who
saw that.
lives in Edinburgh. But that's not me.
Yeah.
I'm the nonlinear multimodal careerist guy. If you go to LinkedIn, you'll see a picture of me on the TEDx stage at Times Square, TEDx Times Square in New York at the Times Center, beautiful space. And then a picture of me in the studio with my headphones. It's a record that I did last year that just came out, actually,
Ooh.
with a woman named Elise Morris. She's a fantastic singer-songwriter, keyboard player. I have a website called improvisingcareers.com. Go there and check it out. I keep a travel log of all the interesting places that I go or events that I'm involved in, although
Yeah.
not since February.
I was
And
actually
then please check out my course
oh yeah.
called Future Proofing Your Data Science Career. And it's on LinkedIn Learning. If you do a Google search on it or go to LinkedIn Learning, it should pop up. And again, if you're not a data scientist, I would encourage you to go to the Future Career Toolkit, which is kind of 3 chapters in. And it's discipline agnostic, and the tools we talked about earlier in the podcast are there. Check it out. And I think it could be very helpful, especially if you're looking to make a move,
Yeah.
identify your next opportunity, or find a job. The tools will help you do that for sure in a very tactical, practical way. So,
Definitely. Sorry to interrupt there. I'll make sure I have the links in the description there because there's
yeah.
a lot of great content there. Take this course. Like I have an affinity for data science. I actually enjoyed it for multiple reasons, but I think that even if you're not in the data science field, you can benefit from it and learn about the model that way as well.
Well, thank you.
So what can we have as a call to action for the audience today then, besides checking out the course?
Yeah. So when I think as I mentioned, I do these workshops at universities called How to Succeed at Jobs That Don't Exist Yet.
Hmm.
I've done it at a bunch of schools in New York, Columbia, and Baruch. I've done it at Duke University, at Texas A&M. But so when I close out, after describing what I think future careers are going to be, and the context is socio-historical, how we got to now. But I say to students or to listeners or participants, you're going to do stuff that's going to look like magic to me, based on what I've seen over the past X number of years since I graduated from college. So get to it.
Yeah.
I want to see it. It's going to be cool. We're at a tipping point, an inflection point where technologies are enabling global communication and innovation and collaboration at an unprecedented level. I mean, topics like disciplines like education, like sustainable energy, like travel and transportation. I mean, on and on and on. Media and entertainment. It's going to be really cool, and you guys and gals are going to do interesting stuff. So get on it.
Yeah.
Time's wasted.
Don't get me started on smart cities too.
Well, smart cities too, for sure.
Yeah. So beyond that, there's one quote I want to re-mention is learn, unlearn, and relearn that you said earlier. I really love that. I even wrote it down in quotes. Once again, this is Dustin Miller, PolyInnovator, and this was Christopher Bishop on the Polymath Polycast. Thank you.
Thank you.